Hello, High Rock. Welcome to our daily devotional. We're continuing with our walk through the Gospel of Mark, where we're tracking along with the Sunday sermons. And previously, we had said we're going to cover just the passages that run in between the sermons. But on some weeks, we're going to actually double up and go back to some of the passages that we talked about. Just because they're worth looking at, and we can go a little bit more in depth than we can on Sundays. And today we're going to be looking at some of the passage or part of the passage that Pastor Dave preached on Sunday about Sabbath. So we are in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to read this for us.
Hear the word of the Lord. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, there's a lot in this passage, and on a Sunday you have to kind of gloss over some of this. The fact that they're quote unquote harvesting grain in the field, it's hardly harvesting. They're doing something that's called gleaning. It's provided for in the Old Testament law as a protection for sojourners, travelers, poor people, that you had to leave the edges of your grain fields unharvested so that those people, poor people, travelers, things like that, could come in and take some of the grain in order to feed themselves. In fact, when I was traveling in Israel and Jordan, we came across a field that was set up like this, and had the opportunity to take one of the heads of wheat and roll it in my hands and blow off all the chaff and everything, and eat the grains inside, which were really kind of chewy and nutty. It was kind of a fun experience. And so what they're doing is hardly harvesting in any case. But Jesus makes an even more important point, saying that Sabbath is something that is set up to serve our needs. If you look at the original application of Sabbath, it is basically something where they were demanding a day of rest, or God was having them ask for a day of rest through Moses when they were enslaved. This idea was that it was a way, kind of a protection against not just that enslavement, but anything that might enslave us, especially work, that we might begin to think that we live to work rather than working to live. And so this is a protection that's meant to protect us from things that would put us in bondage. And so the irony here is that the Pharisees are trying to use the very law that's meant to keep them free. They're using it as another form of bondage, that where you're not free to be able to feed yourself because you are sojourning, you're traveling through this area. And so there's this ultimate irony. So Jesus points out this time when King David, when he was fleeing, he was able to take some of the showbread, the sacred bread that was meant only for the priest. It was a violation of sacred law, a bigger violation than the violation of Sabbath here, and David was fully justified in that moment. And so even when Jesus says this to him, actually, if you look into the kind of the way he said it originally was even more force, is have you never read? Like, not haven't you ever read, but have you never read? It's almost a challenge. Like, don't you people understand? Like, you're supposed to be the experts in the law. You should see right here a very clear example that the rules that God set up are meant to serve us and not the other way around. And so, and if that's not enough, Jesus ends this whole thing by saying that the Son of Man, which is referring to himself, is Lord even of the Sabbath. He's pointing, like, if you don't buy any of the other arguments, in the end, the whole law and everything is meant to serve God, and in particular the King that God is setting up, which is Jesus, the Son of Man, this Messiah figure. And so, if anyone has authority to declare how the Sabbath should be observed, it's Jesus. So all of this kind of layers together, and Pastor Dave, as he was talking about it this Sunday, really brought up 4 points that I think are worth repeating here. Basically, kind of underlying principles of Sabbath that we can remember and think about, so that we can practice in a Sabbath in a way that actually does bring the kind of freedom and rejuvenation that God intends, rather than doing something because it has to be done. Rather, instead, doing something because we can learn to want to, because it's good for us. And so the four principles he talked about were, one is that first purpose of Sabbath is that it's a time to reconnect with God. It can be very difficult in our busy lives to do that. Well, here's a time that's a day that we set aside to do that. It's a time to reconnect with others, to be together with one another, for, to join in with the spiritual family that we have. And Pastor Megan's going to talk about kind of that spiritual family in this coming Sunday. Another thing is to relish God's creation. There's a lot of different ways we can do that. Pastor Joe Marcucci and I are going to be heading up this weekend to the White Mountains. We're going to do some winter hiking, spend 2 nights overnight in the Lonesome Lake Lodge. It's going to be a lot of fun. And that's one of the ways that really helps me relish God's creation. I don't know what it'll be for you, but that's something to be thinking through. And the fourth principle Dave brought up was that Sabbath is for reflecting God's creativity by being creative in a way that's different than we're required to be creative during the rest of the week for our work. And it's being creative, not just consuming entertainment. He brought up the point that the muses were, in Greek mythology, the muses were these, spiritual beings who provided inspiration to artists and creators and things like that. And the word amuse means the opposite. A is kind of a negation prefix. And so amusement is where we're not being creative. It's where we're just consuming the creativity of others. And so this was kind of a warning contained in here to not just make Sabbath about consuming entertainment where we shut off our creativity, but rather being creators ourselves, to, because God is a creator, right? We see that in the very first pages of the Bible. And if we're created in the image of God, then there's something in us that is fulfilled only when we are creative as well. So these four principles were reconnect with God, reconnect with others, to relish God's creation, and to reflect God's creativity by being creative ourselves. So I think that's, worth rehashing and thinking about. And Michael, I'm especially interested, how you apply this in your own life, or maybe even how you teach it to some of the kids that you work with.
Yeah, I've always, well, not always. So growing up, I didn't really, even, funny enough, growing up in the church, Sabbath was not something that I really even heard about, aside from the Ten Commandments. And it never really crossed my mind that, oh, this is something I should pay attention to, which, could probably give you a good background of what my Christian upbringing was like growing up. Anyway, but I think
the Ten Commandments, it's God's top 10 list, right? So it should,
yes, yeah.
it should be important at some level, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But then I think what happened is when I did start to when I kind of became aware of oh, Sabbath, it's a commandment, then I began to take it very seriously. And I can even remember in our marriage, it causing some with Grace and I some conflict, because I was like, we need to have a Sabbath day and we need to do these Sabbath practices. And I was like, we're going to set it apart by lighting these Sabbath candles to signify that we are resting. And it was the most anxious and unrestful time. And it just did not work. And I was like, okay, well, that's not Sabbath. And so I really appreciated.
Well, and just to be careful there, you mentioned a lot of practices there with the lighting the candles, things that works for a lot of people. That is actually a good way for some people to set aside that day and to recognize that we're creating a kind of a different space. It just wasn't working for you and Grace.
Yes. Yeah. And it wasn't working because I was missing, as Dave was kind of missing the reason of Sabbath, missing the point of how Sabbath is meant to be, to meet the needs. And that was not meeting the need. It was essentially creating a need. And what I really appreciate about Dave's sermon, and even in this story, is just how clear it is that this is something that's meant to be for us to really allow us. I think Dave talked about how it's meant to help us be whole again, and that is the purpose of Sabbath. And I think what even resonates even more deep to me is, the more I reflect on it, is seeing why are we given Sabbath, or how do we even think about Sabbath? And I often don't think about it as being given, or this gift, and actually coming out of God's very own self and God's very own experience of when we read the creation narrative of how he created the world in 6 days, but then he rested on the seventh, and then it says he blessed it and made it holy. He set it apart. And I think just that very that creates a very central idea of who God is, and how God goes about the world, and also what he wants to invite us into. Because I think ultimately we're meant to be, reflections of God, meant to bear God's image. And if we are to do that, then Sabbath becomes this thing that we can practice in so many different ways. And I think that's also what I really appreciate about Dave's sermon, particularly around reflecting God's creativity, of just being like, there's so many ways that we can create new practices or new ways of rest, and the more that we open ourselves up to rest, the more and different ways of rest, the more we can actually experience like God's goodness. But we have to make space for it, and we have to also have the right intention around it. So that's kind of like where I'm at when it comes to Sabbath currently.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Not, it reminds me of a particular challenge I had around Sabbath. And, you know, one of the ways I've come to think of Sabbath is that you work the rest of the days, right? And Sabbath is a time for enjoying the things that you're working for, right? Like, so you're working to support your family. Well, you need to spend time actually enjoying your family. Otherwise, what's the purpose of all the work? It's kind of like the Sabbath actually gives purpose to the other days that you are working. And when I was part of this group called Barnabas Ministries, run by Dick Germain, he used to be pastor of First Congregational in Hopkinton, they had an event where they brought in Chuck Slagan, who was the head of New Hope Counseling Center, and they came in. He's retired now, but I remember this particular talk that he gave. He was challenging us pastors to honor Sabbath, and he says, I know a lot of you practice Sabbath, but you do it in a way that doesn't honor the actual principle. And that the reason why is, he said, because I know most of you take off Monday. And for typical pastors in a typical church, Sunday is the busiest day. It's the day that is, fulfilling, but also the most draining. You finish Sunday being totally depleted emotionally. Many people do. And then most pastors then take Monday off as a day off. And so basically that time when they have to spend with their families are, when their kids are off at school, so they don't actually have to spend time with them. And the time that they do, they're like the most drained they are of the entire week. And so they're giving their family the leftovers, the kind of the dregs that are left over at the bottom of the barrel. Nothing good is left. He said, instead, I really challenge you to rearrange your week and finish things up early enough so that you can take off on a Friday or Saturday when everyone is actually really available. And on Monday, do light administrative duty, answer emails, things like that, things that don't require a lot of emotional energy. And then you're replenished by the time you get to Friday or Saturday. And that way you're actually able to give your family the best of what you have to offer, rather than just this drained self that actually nobody wants to be around. You're not a gift to anybody at that point. Anyway, so when Chuck brought that up, it was a really challenging perspective. As pastors, we were pretty widely just doing it to check off a box and feel like we were satisfying, the requirements of what we're supposed to do and what we're asking other people to do, but we were doing it in a way that it wasn't really fulfilling its purposes. Michael, I'm wondering if you have any final things to say or add, and if you'd close us in prayer.
Yeah, I think the only final thing has been just kind of a phrase that has helped me kind of get my mindset, or I guess like in a healthy place for around Sabbath, is like moving more towards flexibility rather than rigidity. Maybe you start off as a Saturday being your Sabbath, but you find out that doesn't work well. So then it's okay to shift to a Monday, right? And it's okay to be having different rhythms and trying things out. And that can actually be part of the restful experience, or even reflecting God's creativity. So that's just my encouragement, is to just be flexible and to not be rigid when it comes to it. So I'll pray for us and for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for this gift of Sabbath rest. I pray the people listening to this, they would hear this invitation to be brought into this life-giving practice. And I pray that as they think about what it means to rest, that they would look to you, and they would have the courage to invite others into that conversation too. And also the grace to be flexible with the way that they go about it, the day they pick, or how they choose to rest, and knowing that it's going to be a journey. To your name I pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining us. And if you have any particular insights or questions about Sabbath, maybe you have some ideas, I really encourage you to throw them into the comments on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're seeing this devotional. Thanks for joining us. I hope to see you again tomorrow.